Hello and welcome to episode 2 of our podcast, An Examined Life. I'm Richa Sharma. I'm a mental health professional and founder of a social enterprise, The Dialectical Mind. In this series, we talk to experts on life, resilience, and mental health, and we shed light on issues that more often than not weigh heavily upon us, our thoughts, and our feelings. And yet, somehow, we find ourselves shying away from speaking freely about them. In this episode, we have with us Dr. Shwetank Bansal, who is a consultant psychiatrist and psychotherapist at BLK Super Speciality Hospital and Better Me Healthcare, New Delhi. We're excited to have him with us. Hello and welcome to the episode.
Thank you.
In this episode, we will examine sorrow, loss, and grief and how it impacts us, our lives, thoughts, feelings, relationships, and our connection with ourselves and others. So first, I'd like to talk about the general sense of loneliness and sadness that seems to have emanated due to the pandemic. This phenomenon is also being referred to as pandemic grief, and it is so massive that nobody seems to be untouched by it. As the poet Charles Bukowski puts it in one of his poems, there's a loneliness in this world so great that you can see it in the slow movement of the hands of a clock. It seems as if the current pandemic has brought our emotional vulnerabilities to the surface, and the experience of this loneliness seems to be pervasive. As a mental health professional, what has been your experience with regards to this observation? Also, I think as a large number of people still feel a sense of shame in reaching out to a professional or might find it difficult to afford help. What are some strategies that lay people can use to create a sense of connectedness with others as well as themselves?
Pandemic grief is a phenomenon that's all around us and within us right now. And I think, there are prominently two factors which control how we process grief in general. There's sharing of what we are grieving about, and then there is the getting busy with other things and moving on. The pandemic has ensured that both are limited and significantly restricted. Sharing is obviously restricted. We can't have other people in the room. We've had cremation ceremonies where no one's been able to attend, where there've been token cremations as well, which have really interfered with the closure that family can get in that situation. So there's that sharing element that's been disrupted by the pandemic because of the social distancing, the physical distancing norms in place under the COVID appropriate behavior. But not only that, along with this, the phenomenon of just getting involved with other things, resuming regular office work, going back to the humdrum of life, the things that allow one to move on, leaving home, just going someplace, perhaps traveling, all of those things have been restricted. And therefore, figuratively speaking, it's difficult to get some fresh air. And because of that, one tends to have that grief reverberating through them for much, much longer. And so what we are seeing is that there's that protracted grief that's happening. What's also um, significantly amplifying it is the reflected grief, that you're going through your grief over and over and over again as you see others around you going through a similar sort of fate. So when people are losing their near and dear ones and they're seeing other people around them, their friends, extended family, also losing people in their immediate vicinity, there is that reliving of one's own grief which is happening. And normally, in another situation where it will help people communicate and bond and empathize, in this case, it's actually in some ways making it worse. As far as the second point you raised about how someone can go about establishing better connectedness within oneself and with the others, um, my suggestion would be that we need to look at improving closeness within the limitations that exist. Now, how do we do that? When it comes to other people, calling your friend instead of texting or just dropping a message on Instagram or Facebook, having a Zoom party to celebrate birthdays, because those little celebrations are like tiny islands in this ocean of grief that we are all floating in. So it's important to really deck up those islands so that they are that much more significant. So a little bit more effort, just changing the mode in which you're communicating with someone, setting apart time to communicate with people, couples, living together. It's important to have dates, even if you're living together, which involve dressing up, setting up a table, setting up perhaps a candlelight if you're into that sort of stuff. But the idea is to ritualize. So those rituals, Saturday night is movie night, whether it be on Zoom, whether it be on FaceTime, which new feature that they just came out with. Those rituals help connect. They help bind. They give us a sense of security within this swirling vortex of entropy, if you will. So it helps create some sense of predictability to the day and to the week, which really helps keep a person grounded. So this would help with establishing better connectedness with people around as well as within oneself. Having a set routine through the day is something that's helping a lot of people just uh, be connected with themselves, creating some time, whatever structure you can create within the confines of your home, within the confines of whatever place you're in, creating a corner which is your work corner, and the rest of the corner is your leisure corner or your home corner, would help with a little bit of a better work-life balance, even within those confines. So to try and create a bit of familiarity within the unfamiliarity that we are all facing would help. Basically, to summarize, if I had to, it's just giving more quality time to each other. That would help.
Thank you for that response. And I think there's just one thing that I would require your practical advice on, where you said about getting yourself into a routine. A lot of times people struggle with getting themselves into that routine, right? So it's more like something which is easier said than done. So what would be those practical points which people can, be mindful of, which will help them get into that routine, which is so essential?
Yeah, that's a very pertinent question you asked. I'm glad you asked it. One of the basic problems with setting up routines, the same thing that happens with New Year resolutions, is that we are able to continue for a couple of days, and after that it just drops off, and then all we're left with is the guilt, the resounding guilt of making another plan and yet another plan that did not come out in practice. What I suggest to clients as well is to not make a routine supposing that you'd be a better person in the future. We always tend to do that. We plan for someone else, some other new and improved 2.0 version of one's own self that we're planning for. So, and that's why those plans don't work out, because that 2.0 will happen after the plan is implemented, not before. So it would be helpful to try and make a plan on the template of yesterday. Go through the day that you had yesterday, go and visit the day that you would eventually want to have. Take some elements from that day that you eventually want to have and graft into yesterday. So what that means is, if you want to get into an exercise routine, very often exercise routines uncannily are scheduled around 6 a.m. And when a person is normally more used to getting up at 8. Now, the moment you've made this new habit, which is hard to imbibe, the moment you've made it contingent on another breaking another habit, we know that it's a battle that's already lost. So why not instead look at, okay, yesterday I got up at 8. I've been getting up at 8 for every day for the last 3 months or 6 months. So I'll and consequently I don't have enough time in the morning. So instead of creating a half hour or a 1 hour exercise slot, why not I look at creating 5 minutes of an exercise slot, maybe between 1 and 2, where I normally take my lunch, something like that. So now 5 minutes would not sound substantial, but the idea here is not that in 5 minutes you won't get too much exercise. The idea is you've got a foot in the door. That 5 minute routine is now part of your day, and you can gradually expand on it. Maybe it helps you feel motivated enough, if you've done it for 7 or 10 days together, that it will allow you to then get up maybe half an hour earlier or an hour earlier, and you can gradually expand that 5 minute window into a bigger window for exercise. The idea is to get the start to be as easy as possible, as convenient as possible. We often, unfortunately, end up doing the opposite.
Thanks for that tip. I think so. Tinkering a little bit with the existing routines is the way to go, is what you're saying. All right. So talking of the more specific facets of grief, I'd like to talk about the grief that comes from the experience of being wounded in the literal as well as metaphorical sense of the word. Many philosophers, poets, and spiritual masters over the ages have spoken about the importance of suffering, the importance of the experience of being wounded. And it is believed that this experience is supposed to understand ourselves as well as others with greater authenticity, depth, and insight. As the Sufi poet Jalaluddin Rumi puts it, wound is the place where the light enters you. So my question to you is, as a civilization, are we more wounded today than ever?
Well, I think if we were to talk about civilizations and the flow of civilization since the dawn of humanity, I think every every generation would have pondered over that very exact same question, that are we more wounded than ever? It's probably, I think it's just a case of the wearer knows where the shoe bites. It's about one's own experiences, and when we compare it to a sepia colored past, it would seem harsher. I'm not saying that the generation right now has it easy and everything's going fine, we're just making a hue and cry. Of course, we are in the middle of major turmoil, global turmoil, and a lot of lives have been lost. A lot more lives have been um, indelibly affected by what's happened and what's currently ongoing. But in that quote from Rumi is where we find the answer, right? That it's through the wound that the light enters. It's through the wound. It's through our experiences. It's through our perception that changes while experiencing what we are. That we also find answers to the questions that sometimes would have been plaguing us for years together. So um, it's possible that we are very wounded, but with that also comes the ability to heal. We just need to keep looking for it, and every single person's solution there is uh, a bit different from the others. It's more about the individuals, more about the personality that one has, to find out what works for them. The important concept there is to just keep moving. Whatever answer it is that you're trying to find, whatever healing that you're trying to find for the wound that you've gone through, will not come by standing in one place. It's important to look at whatever direction beckons out to you, and start moving in that direction. Over a period of time, you'll have an eventual direction to take as well. I hope that's not too philosophical.
No, I think that's very pertinent because what you've talked about is exploring this inherent resilience that all of us have, and somehow we're not able to
Yeah.
tap into. So it gives us an opportunity to do that. Also, talking about the practical implications of it, for many people, this could be the first time in their lives that they or their loved ones have been afflicted with an illness which runs a rather long course or requires long bouts of isolation. For some, it could be their first arrest with the public health system, which is unfortunately overburdened, overcrowded, and marked with so much apathy. And when we're talking about that light entering us through the wound, how does one find the light in such a scenario, especially given that nobody knows when things are going to get back to being the way they used to be?
Well, for starters, I don't think things will ever go back to how they were. I think what we are going through right now has changed parts of us forever. It's changed how we look at ourselves. It's changed how we look at relationships with others. It's probably also changed how we look at work, how we look at work-life balance, the meaning of life, the meaning of time, the meaning of togetherness. I think it's changed all of those things, and therefore there are certain things that once seen you cannot unsee, and it's just one of those things. So I don't think solace comes from the knowledge that things will go back to how they used to be. I think it comes from the new versions that we are developing, the new version of the world that we'll be entering after this. That said, speaking epidemiologically, what we know is that the pandemic won't just one day end. It'll gradually fizzle out. So that might go on for a while. So there'll be waves and waves, and gradually the gaps between the waves increase, the intensity of the waves drops, and that's how it gradually blends into normalcy. Light would come from knowing that we've had something like this 100 years ago and that ended. So this will end too. Light would come from understanding that with far fewer facilities, people coped then and we will cope too. It can come from seeing of the heroic efforts we see around us of people, everyday lay people, common people helping each other out. The activism that we saw on social media, social media took on a completely different form of this helpline where people could just ping for a cylinder and it'll be there. Some stranger from some corner of the city who they've never met, heard, or seen will suddenly drop off a cylinder there. So that those lessons will remain. Those lessons will have given us newfound faith in other people around us. And if that's not light, what else is it?
All right. Moving further in the discussion, I would like to, I think, highlight a very important question of impermanence of life, and especially given the circumstances. There have been so many, lives lost, and that is, I think, something which is at the back of everybody's mind right now. So, for that, I have a poem by Robert Frost, which describes this phenomenon very beautifully. And it reads: Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Every leave's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay. So while somehow in the process of growing up, we acquaint ourselves with the inevitability of death, we also seek solace in this idea of a life well lived. So much of what we do in our everyday lives, be it our education, work, our relationships, is all in this pursuit of this idea of a life well lived. However, this pandemic has denied us this opportunity, because there's so many, it's claimed so many young lives, and so unexpectedly, it almost seems unfair. Uh, Also, in cases of the elderly passing away, we cannot help but notice a lack of dignity in death. So, how does one begin to deal with all the anger, denial, helplessness, and grief that comes with these lives being lost, and in so many cases without even getting a chance to say goodbye?
I think with COVID, what we've seen is that the loneliness that's prevailed in grief, like we talked about at the start of the episode, that's been humongous, and it's multiplied the grief. It's echoed all through, and when we talk about young deaths, we talk about elderly deaths without dignity, without having the people they love around them. It's obviously heart wrenching. It's something that affects all the loved ones left behind. Dealing with it involves accepting it for what has happened, accepting that, accepting why it's happened, accepting that there were only certain parts that could be controlled in it, um, and those that the person attempted to control, that they did whatever they could under the circumstances. A very big part of grief, is coming from not being able to communicate, not being able to see their loved ones in their final moments because they're in hospital and they're isolated. So it's been a useful technique that I found in therapy to help people to get to write a goodbye letter to their loved ones, or a goodbye note on their phone to the loved ones. Um, Clients initially, some respond with skepticism, saying that that person's not going to read it, that person's not going to hear it. My answer to them is that it's not for that person, it's actually for you. It's for you to be able to close that chapter gracefully and move on, not because that's what you want to do, but because you have no choice, and we have to accept that. And that's where acceptance comes in. Acceptance comes in where we can't alter what's there around us, and so that we can then focus on altering what we can alter around us. And that's something that's been found of use with clients. The concept of the life well lived, it's something that we all live with, don't we? That I'll do XYZ and eventually I'll do this, and all of my life, I'm hurtling towards this eventual stage, that stage at which I would have arrived. That would be, my song. It'll establish me, and so on and so forth. I think it's time to revise that thought process. It's important to remove the eventually from some things. Some things I think it's important to implement right now. It's important to not delay, not make it contingent on so many things that they never get done. It's a very famous, quote, Steve Jobs quote, that I stand in front of the mirror every morning and I ask myself that if it were my last day today, would I still go about it the way I'm about to go about it right now? And he said that for too many days together, if the answer was no, then I knew that I was doing something wrong and I needed to make a change. So not that I'm talking of a silver lining to what's happening, there isn't any. But the message to receive from it is that perhaps we shouldn't be indefinitely postponing, delaying, procrastinating certain things which are important to us. So it's important to separate out what's really important from what's all the noise and access that and try and get that into your life. So it helps uh, understand what's really important and what's not. And that's a quality that death has always had. That's the quality that a finish always has. And it's that we can access. That's something that we can access only.
So I think what you're saying also gives us a higher sense of control over our own lives. Is gives us a more higher sense of ownership, and that's also what we need in times of uncertainty. But there's also a question here, because how do we reconcile them? Because there's, on one end, we have to like make the best of what we have, is what you're suggesting, and on the other hand, there's also this fatigue and this malaise sort of not wanting to do anything because we don't know what the future is. So how does what and how does one reconcile, and how does one deal with the pressure? We know that we should live our best life, but and it shouldn't weigh down on us. It shouldn't come as a pressure. So how does one tread that line?
So one concept is for setting targets, and the other one is to set the sub targets to implement them. So while looking at, I want, let's say, I want to stay in the hills eventually, can be changed to I want to move there ASAP. And right now I'm working from home, so perhaps I can do that. And why not just, take a sample of that kind of life right now, provided that my work life allows me to do that right now. That's something, of course, in the middle of a lockdown would not be done. But once things ease out and this becomes feasible, with safety precautions all ensured, this is something that can be done rather than being delayed indefinitely. By this, I do not mean that you go all out and try and accomplish everything right now. I'm just saying, just to get clarity about what's important, this would be helpful in creating that blueprint. How to implement that blueprint or how to build along that blueprint will be at the pace that is to some extent defined by the circumstances around us. And that's where pacing yourself comes in. It's important to not wear yourself out. There have been clients who, when diagnosed with COVID, would want to take that time to finish all of the stuff that's been pending. Now, all of that stuff that's been pending has been pending because it's taxing, it's hard work, it's perhaps boring, it's something that doesn't enthuse them. And when you have COVID wearing you down, that's the last time you should be trying to pick up that stuff, because that will only drag you down further. So I'm saying that a judicious use of resources there would be helpful. So perhaps while you're down with COVID, uh, just watch Netflix, just relax, allow yourself to heal, sleep more, eat better as much as you can. And once you recover, you can gradually pace yourself to fulfilling those targets.
Right. Thanks for that. Moving on, I have another poem, and this is also about losing someone you love. This is a poem by W.H. Auden, and it reads: When you lose someone you love, your life becomes strange. The ground beneath you becomes fragile. Your thoughts make your eyes unsure, and some dead echo drags your voice down, where words have no confidence. Your heart has grown heavy with loss. And though this loss has wounded others, no one knows what has been taken from you. Now, this poem highlights the very personal nature of grief and how sometimes any efforts at a consolation might feel like an intrusion. So, I would like to ask you how one should communicate with someone who's experiencing grief. When should we speak to them? When should we refrain? How much time is enough time to grieve? And when should we go out and seek help for a person who's grieving? And in more precarious cases, for example, where a person who's going through grief also has a pre-existing mental health condition, how do we, just deal with such situations?
A lot of people feel very uncomfortable. They just don't know how to react when someone close to them loses a loved one. My first suggestion would be that don't hesitate in reaching out, because the person who's grieving would appreciate being, just having someone just check in. That conversation, I know that a lot of people dread that conversation, what to say. It's not as important what you say. It's more important that you reached out. That act by itself matters a lot. Even if the only thing you say is, the cliche, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry for your loss. That's enough. It just tells the person, just the fact that the call went through means that you're thinking of them. They're there in your thoughts. It makes them feel a little less alone, especially under the circumstances. If one does feel that a conversation must be had, it's important to stray clear of directions being provided to that person. Don't cry, don't feel sad. Oh, they've lived a full life. Um, there are so many others who've died. I know this person who's passed away as well. He was so young. So, this person was not even that young. All of those are invalidating in nature. The best thing would be to just allow the person to grieve with you by opening up. If they want to talk about the loved one who's passed away, allow them to do that. Ask them questions about that person so that there is that ventilation that can occur. It's usually found to be very, very helpful. So to not ask them to be strong, don't cry, be strong, you have to take care of this person or that person. Be strong, you have so much more to look forward to. Be strong, there's so much misery all around. All of that, again, seems very, very invalid because it presupposes that the person is not already being strong in handling what they're handling. So my suggestion would be very, very simple. Make a call, try and listen more than you do. As far as when to seek help, well, it's a very arbitrary cutoff that we define that if you find yourself grieving your loved one for more than 6 months, you should seek help. It sounds very artificial and robotic, but those are the guidelines then for you, right? It's a general cutoff, doesn't define an individual experience, but a mass, the population as a whole. Essentially, if you find that the grief has affected you to a level where your everyday functioning has collapsed. By collapsed, I mean that you're not able to sleep for extended periods of time. You're not able to have your meals. You're not able to take care of yourself. You're not able to bathe. You're not able to brush. You just don't feel like getting up from bed. And if this is happening for weeks together, a couple of weeks or more together, if you start feeling suicidal, if you start contemplating about how you're going to go about it, all of those are warning signs. They're signs that you must reach out for professional help, irrespective of the duration of when this happens. Alongside that, if the grief goes on for too long, if it's causing you to not work, if it's causing you to cut off from everyone and self isolate, and if that's gone on for too long, if that's gone on for months together, then you might consider seeking help. You can see either a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist who's easily accessible so as to get the requisite help in the case. This can be fixed, it can be addressed. It's not something that the mental health professional will not be able to help you with. This does not require for what's happened to unhappen. What's happened has happened. It's the coping that can be worked on. It's the perception that can be worked on. Sometimes, when we are in a very negative state of mind, the smallest of things can seem like huge challenges. So, getting the opinion of someone who's removed from your situation is sometimes very helpful in getting certain things straight and getting a direction as to what steps to take. So, that way, it can be vitally helpful. If you're helping someone who's lost a loved one recently, try and watch out for these signs. If you're finding these signs there, don't hesitate to suggest that they seek out help, and don't hesitate to be present in the session with them, because that will really help their morale if a loved one is there. Often in the session, when someone's grieving, they might not find it significant enough to even communicate their pain. Someone who knows about their pain, someone who knows about what they're going through, being in the session can really help, because they can provide the mental health professional with all of the details that are required to understand the way forward. As far as those with pre-existing mental illnesses are concerned, of course, this is a high risk state. So there needs to be a higher level of vigilance, because when they have a pre-existing mental health condition, this sort of a situation can make them compromise the measures they are taking to address that condition. It could mean missing the medications that they've been on. It could mean missing therapy sessions when they are actually most important to attend. So just having someone check in about the appointments, whether they are being kept or not, or offering to, be present on the Zoom call when the appointment happens, would not be a bad idea.
Thanks for that response. I would like to ask another question, and this is about survivor's guilt. And if that is something which people are experiencing these days, because there's something that I get to hear from people, is this experience where the entire family has contracted the infection, and often because of limited resources and time, the caregiving efforts tend to be concentrated towards the most vulnerable in the family, because the family fears for the life of this person. And recovery of the healthier people or the younger people in the family is often presupposed. However, in a lot of cases, families end up losing the person they least expected to. And this is often accompanied by a lot of guilt and pain. How would you like to put that in perspective?
Survivor's guilt is very real. In case of COVID, where we have entire families getting afflicted and one member or two members passing away, survivor's guilt is perhaps much more immense, because everyone's been in the same situation. You're absolutely right, Richa, that there are certain people who are seen as vulnerable and that they get cared for more. And in cases where they survive, they end up having a lot of guilt about the other person who was caring for them having passed away. There are lots of families in which the elderly have recovered, especially in the second wave, where the elderly have recovered without complications, but the next generation, those not no, those younger, have either gotten seriously ill, gotten hospitalized, or in worst case scenarios even passed away. There is a significant amount of survivor's guilt there. There's the hope that and the indignation that why was I not chosen to go? Why was it that that my child is the one who had to suffer so much? Talking in these situations, mostly, it involves going along the lines of looking at what could be controlled under the situation, under the circumstances, looking at um, the things that could have been done and were not done, and usually there aren't any. When you take stock of that, you find that everything that could have been done was done. It was the external limitations that were blocking certain routes, and that's not something that one person or even one family could change. It doesn't solve the issue of survival guilt, but it makes it sting a bit less when they realize that they did everything they could under the circumstances to help the person who eventually passed away or eventually got seriously ill. It helps with closure to have the family talk about it. Often, what I see in our families is that they don't talk about the one who's passed away. It's almost like they feel guilty about bringing that person up because that will make the other person in the family cry, or they're all on their individual, they're in their individual bubbles, so to say. They're all grieving together but alone. They don't want to talk to each other about it. Everyone's handling it in a different way, but they're not wanting to talk to each other about it because it's like they think of it as taboo, that what if I start crying and the other person will also start crying and it'll just affect everyone. I'd like to just highlight there that having been someone who's talked to these different members of the same family who've lost some of ones, sitting in different rooms, they're all going through the same thing. It'll be much better if they could talk to each other. It would be much, much better because no one else knows exactly what they're going through. Only they know because they've been closest to that person. So it's important to keep talking at that point. Memorializing the person who's been lost is extremely important as well. Um, having maybe 15 days later, 1 month later, whenever they feel the need, pulling out old photographs, discussing the person who's left them, discussing the happy moments as well is very, very important. It helps with their closure and that person's closure as well, perhaps. Another aspect that I'd like to highlight over here is about the children in the families. And we don't really want to talk to children about death. And I think that's a problem because that gives them a very, very warped version of the experience. If a lot of clients, in their 40s and 50s and 60s, when I talk to them and they talk, the discussion veers to the topic of death and how was it when they first experienced someone's death around them. They have a very gray sort of a picture. They just remember hushed voices and adults around them just talking between themselves, not really sharing with the children. So the children are excluded from the actual conversation, but they are just sensing that something is wrong. I think it contributes significantly to the fear of the word death. And even though it happens to all of us, it's universal, we still just don't want to think about it. We don't want to talk about it. We develop these euphemisms, right? Passing on, passing away, kicking the bucket, so on and so forth. We just want to avoid that term. And I think it's important to use this as a teaching moment, to teach your children about death. Talk to them about the life that was lived, the fact that person is no more now, the person has died, and what that means, because a child is likely to not understand the euphemism that's used. So it's important to uh, speak in a straight language to the child for better understanding and for the child to understand. Children often end up blaming themselves for what's happened. They somehow carry this for years together, that I think I had contributed to it in some way. So it's important to clarify the person who passed away loved you and they really cared about you. And if they could, they would have probably stayed around. And so that would include the child in the journey that the family is taking. And it's that inclusion that matters. Otherwise, the guilt that comes from it, half of it is coming from not being included in the discussion.
So I think that response does this job of dissipating the ominous silence that we have around death,
Yeah.
and how it's also important. It's okay to cry, and it's also important not to compartmentalize our grief. So thanks for
Yeah.
that response. Coming to the end of our discussion now, in one of her poems, Mary Oliver says, "To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing that your life depends on it. And when the time comes to let it go, let it go." So, would you be able to share with us some insights into this act of letting go, and why is it so important? And how can we, help ourselves and others in this act of letting go?
I think when we use the phrase letting go, I think principally what we are looking at letting go off is the negative memory that we have with the closure of the incident, especially when it involves someone passing away. So, in a sense, letting go is not just letting go; it's actually holding on to the good stuff, and not having just the concentrated bad stuff with you. So, letting go would mean having, a good representation of everything that's happened, so as to draw meaning from it, to uh, draw courage from it, to build a future. So I think that it's vitally important that we are able to process grief, vitally important that we are able to process the loss of a loved one, and to get to a point where we are at peace with it. It's important to have an have a relatively homogeneous overview of the life that was lived and the relationship that was had, rather than let it just be represented by the loss that eventually occurred. Because loss is something that's coming to everyone. No one can escape, so might as well not give it the pride of place at the center of one's experience or one's story with another person. So let it be, the full stop. But the full stop cannot be the whole sentence.
So what you're talking about is integrating it into the person's life narrative as well, and not to reduce the entire person to just his absence, his or her
Yeah,
absence. Right.
yeah.
So just one more question, because it seems as if we're arriving at this point where we're able to let go. So are there any universal stages in this process of dealing with grief, in processing grief, before we are able to finally arrive at that final point where we're able to let go? So are there any stages that people go through when they're experiencing grief?
Yeah, I think you're prodding me towards Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So Kubler-Ross came out with these 5 stages of grief, and there have been so many interpretations that I'd be a little skeptical about attaching the word universal to them. Because there have been people who've described them not as stages but phases, implying that it's not one after the other necessarily. You can circle through them, you can go into one and then go back into the previous one and the next one. So, but I mean, to summarize, what Kubler Ross talked about was an acronym called DABDA, and when you expand that acronym, it's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. So she described these 5 stages of grief, and later on clarified that, like I said, that they didn't necessarily happen in that order. But she was describing the sort of emotions one goes through when they get to know about their impending demise. If you get handed a medical report that says that you have a few months remaining or a few years remaining, the sort of reaction that a person develops. Um, so she talked about denial being the first stage where one's not able to come to terms with what they've just heard or what they've just realized, followed by anger at the world, anger towards God, anger towards oneself for whatever's missing, anger towards the person handing them that report, the doctor sometimes, anger towards the loved ones for whatever misgivings that have been there, followed by bargaining, where one starts to understand both sides of the story. And bargaining can sometimes be literal bargaining, we going to various religious places, trying to bribe God into changing one's fate, and it often manifests like that too. But uh, that depends on one's level of maturity, depends on one's level of understanding of oneself, and also the level of helplessness one faces. Along with that, there is, the fourth stage that Ross described was that of depression, where often one cycles through these low moods, and then finally acceptance, where one starts to see the incident for what it is, and the meaning of this particular happening with respect to the whole life that's been lived. So, though these stages were described for one's own impending demise, these stages later were found to be representative of what the loved one goes through as well when they get to know about someone who's passed away or about to pass away. and that's why they've been widely adopted. They've taken on different forms in different countries and in different pieces of literature. The spine remains more or less the same, which is perhaps then why the word universal does justice to it as well.
Thanks for that response. Lastly, if there are any concluding remarks that you'd like to make, please share them.
Well, I think I've said a lot of what was to be said. I think I'll just emphasize that when we're stuck in this sort of a situation, it's just important to look at the day to day. Try and just get through today in the best way possible. And the best here does not need to be someone else's best. It's your best under these circumstances. So that star is there, terms and conditions apply, that under these circumstances, let me try and do the best. Even if it is just getting up and brushing my teeth for today, let me just do that. Just try and look at the next hour or the next day, no further than that. You can tackle it when you get there. That would be my parting remark.
Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And
thank you for having me, Richa.
Yeah. And thanks for watching this episode. We will be back soon with more episodes. Till then, stay tuned to our page for more updates and hit like, share, and subscribe. I would like to leave you all with this poem by Dylan Thomas, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night.